Chapter 1: The Fall of a Knight. The lance was still lodged deep in my chest when they dragged me through the mud, paraded like some common criminal before my fellow knights. Blood bubbled from the wound, warm and sickly sweet against my tongue. Each heartbeat sent a fresh wave of pain rippling through my body, but the wound itself was not the worst of it. No, it was the looks on their faces, my brothers in arms, the ones I had fought and bled beside for years. They sneered. I had become a spectacle. Severith the coward, they jeered. The words dug deeper than any blade ever could. My sword arm, once steady and true, was shackled, its strength sapped not by the wound but by the weight of false accusations. The Bretonnian knights, whom I had fought for with my very soul, had branded me a coward, a traitor to the code of chivalry. They threw me to the ground before the Grail Knight, Sir Roland, his armor gleaming with the purity I once revered. His cold gaze was filled with disgust, a knight who had already judged me guilty long before I could offer any defense. My hand trembled as I reached for my sword, still embedded in the corpse of the beast I had slain. It wasn't enough. They needed a scapegoat for their own failures, and I was to be the offering. Severith, you abandoned the field, Sir Roland spat, his voice thick with disdain. The beastmen tore through our lines. And where were you? Cowering in fear, your lance broken at your feet. I fought. I croaked, my voice ragged with pain. I slew the beast. Look at the creature's body. Look at the blood on my blade, but my words fell on deaf ears. The crowd roared, not with admiration but with contempt. They had seen what they wanted to see, a knight fallen from grace. None would hear my truth. I could already feel their verdicts solidifying in the sickening silence that followed. Strip him of his rank, Roland declared, as if he were the lady herself. He is no longer a knight. The jeers intensified as they tore the armor from my body, each piece of steel that clattered to the ground feeling like another piece of my soul being ripped away. The wind howled across the fields, carrying the scent of blood, steel, and rotting beast carcasses. All around me, the bodies of knights and monsters alike littered the battlefield, testament to the chaos I had fought against. I had not run. I had stood my ground, felled the abomination with a blow that should have earned me glory. But none of that mattered now. I was broken. Broken in the eyes of Bretonnia. No knight. No honor. They left me there, bleeding in the mud, to die like some dishonored wretch. Hours passed. The sun began to sink below the horizon, casting an ominous red light over the battlefield. The weight of despair settled over me like a thick fog, crushing the remnants of my spirit. I should have died that day, left to bleed out beneath the weight of my shame. But fate is cruel, and mercy does not come for men like me. It was then, in the dying light, that she found me. A voice soft as silk cut through the stillness. Severith, discarded like so much refuse. Is this how the knights of Bretonnia treat their own? I tried to lift my head, and through the haze of agony and exhaustion I saw her. Lady Nissa, draped in shadow, her pale skin gleaming under the fading sun like the finest porcelain. Her lips curled into a smile that was neither kind nor cruel, but something in between, something twisted. She knelt beside me, her fingers trailing lightly over my broken body. Her touch was electric, sending a jolt of life through me where there should have been none. You have been wronged, she whispered, her voice intoxicating. But I can offer you more than the hollow honor of Bretonnia. I can give you power. Power to crush those who have cast you aside, to take what is rightfully yours. All you must do is accept it. Her words were like a knife in my chest, carving away at the last vestiges of doubt. What had honor done for me? Where was my reward for loyalty? I had given everything, and in return, I had been spat on, thrown to the wolves. Now this woman, this dark, mesmerizing figure, offered me vengeance. What do you want from me? I rasped, every word a battle with the pain that throbbed through my body. "Only your devotion," she purred, her lips brushing against my ear. "Devote yourself to the pleasures of the flesh, the thrill of sensation, and the power that lies beyond. Become more than just a knight. Become something divine." The promise was sickeningly sweet. Even as my mind screamed to resist, my heart, a heart twisted by rage, betrayal, and despair, could not refuse. I nodded, and as I did, I felt something deep within me break, only to be replaced by something far darker. Her smile widened, a hungry gleam in her eyes. "Then rise, Severith. Rise as a disciple of Slaanesh." She stood, and with a simple gesture, the wounds that had threatened to end my life began to knit themselves back together. My flesh twisted and warped, but it healed. As I got to my feet, I felt the shift inside me, the power that coursed through my veins. It was both horrifying and glorious. My body was no longer mine. It belonged to something greater, something infinitely more terrifying. My gaze turned back to the battlefield. The knights of Bretonnia were nothing but specks on the horizon now, oblivious to the fate they had unleashed upon themselves. My lips curled into a smile of my own, cold and cruel. They would all pay, and I would carve my name into their flesh. Chapter 2, The First Cut. The torches flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the stone walls of the decrepit ruin where the cult had gathered. The air was thick with incense and the scent of decaying flesh. My heart raced, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through me. I had already taken my first steps away from the hollow honor of Bretonnia and into something far darker. But now came the true test, an initiation that would bind me irrevocably to the path of Slaanesh. Lady Nissa stood before me, draped in silk and shadow, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling hunger. Behind her, a stone altar stood bathed in the sickly light of purple candles. Upon its surface, symbols I couldn't yet understand were carved into the flesh of a flayed corpse, its eyes wide with eternal agony. I could feel the power emanating from it, a twisted energy that tugged at my soul, pulling me closer to the precipice of damnation. "Severith," Nissa whispered, her voice like velvet wrapping around my mind. "Tonight you will prove your devotion. Tonight you will offer your first true gift to Slaanesh." Her smile was both alluring and monstrous. She held out a curved ceremonial blade, the edge gleaming with unnatural sharpness. I could see the intricate filigree on the handle, adorned with the symbols of the Dark Prince. My hands trembled as I took it, the weight heavier than I expected. There was something about it that felt alive, as if it craved the taste of flesh. "Carve the mark of Slaanesh into your own flesh," she commanded softly, her gaze locking onto mine. "The first cut is always the hardest, but once you taste the ecstasy of pain, you will never turn back." I hesitated, the blade hovering above my skin. The thought of slicing into my own body, of seeing my blood spill onto the cold stone floor, filled me with both dread and an inexplicable yearning. My honor had been stripped away. My knighthood shattered. What was left but to embrace the new path that had been laid before me? Slowly I brought the blade to my chest, the cold steel pressing against my skin. I drew in a ragged breath. Then, with a swift motion, I cut deep. The pain was immediate, searing and pure. Blood welled up from the gash, flowing down my torso in dark, glistening rivulets. But as the agony surged through me, so did something else, something far worse, yet far more exhilarating. A rush of sensation flooded my body, hot and overwhelming, the pain mixing with an unfamiliar pleasure that seemed to ripple through my nerves like fire. I gasped, my knees nearly buckling. My vision blurred, and for a moment I could swear I saw shapes, figures made of shadow and desire, twisting and writhing in the air around me. They whispered to me, their voices soft and seductive, promising power, beauty, and endless pleasure. Deeper, Lady Nissa purred, her voice breaking through the haze. Let Slaanesh feel your devotion. Carve the mark with your own hand, and your body will become a vessel of his will." I obeyed. With shaking hands, I carved deeper into my chest, the blade biting through skin and muscle. The symbol I had been shown, the mark of the Dark Prince, began to take form, each line etched into my flesh with deliberate, brutal precision. Blood poured from the wound, splattering onto the stone floor, pooling around my feet. The scent of iron filled the air, mixing with the sweet incense of the ritual. And yet, with every cut, the sensation intensified. The pain became pleasure, a perverse ecstasy that made my breath quicken, my heart pound. My flesh seemed to warp around the blade, welcoming it as if it craved the destruction. Each cut felt less like an injury and more like a release, a liberation from the constraints of my mortal form. I could feel my body changing, the lines of the mark glowing faintly with the power of Slaanesh. I no longer felt fear, only hunger. When the final cut was made, I stood there, gasping, my hands slick with blood. My chest was a mess of gore and twisted flesh, the mark of Slaanesh now permanently carved into me. The pain still throbbed, but it was no longer agony. It was pleasure, raw, unfiltered, and maddening. My entire body hummed with power, and I could feel Slaanesh watching, feel his presence wrapping around me like a lover's embrace. Lady Nissa stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with approval. She reached out, her fingers tracing the fresh wound. I hissed at her touch, the sensation so intense that it sent shivers down my spine. "You are reborn, Severith," she whispered. "No longer are you a knight of Bretonnia. You are now a servant of Slaanesh. Your flesh is his canvas, and you will carve his will into this world." As she spoke, I felt the first changes begin. My flesh rippled, shifting beneath the surface. The mark glowed brighter, and I felt something stir inside me, something hungry and twisted. My muscles twitched involuntarily, my skin tightening and stretching in unnatural ways. I could see it now, the mutations that would come, the power that would warp me, reshape me into something far beyond human. And I welcomed it. The other cultists began to chant, their voices rising in a dark hymn to the Dark Prince. The air around us thickened with the scent of blood and sweat, the sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping filling the room as the others followed my example, carving their own bodies in devotion to Slaanesh. The room became a symphony of pain and pleasure, a cacophony of ecstasy and torment. I stood among them, my body still trembling from the ritual, but my mind clear. I had crossed the threshold. There was no going back. The man I had been, the knight who fought for honor, for duty, was dead. In his place stood something new, something darker. I looked down at the blood-streaked mark on my chest, the jagged lines pulsing with the power of the warp. This was only the beginning. I would carve my path in blood and flesh, and with every cut, I would rise higher. Chapter 3: The Garden of Flesh. The stench hit me first, thick and pungent, like rotting meat soaked in perfume. It clung to the air, filling my lungs with every breath. Yet it wasn't just the odor that made my skin crawl, it was the heat. The very walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with warmth, as if they were alive, as if the stone itself was sweating with anticipation. My heart raced, and though I had already experienced the ecstasy of pain, nothing could prepare me for what lay ahead in this forsaken place. "The Garden of Flesh," Lady Nissa whispered, her voice dripping with pride. "Our most sacred ground. It is here that the true devotion to Slaanesh is performed. Here, art and agony merge." She led me deeper into the chamber, her lithe form moving gracefully through the thick air, my eyes adjusting to the flickering light of the candles lining the walls, finally focused on the horrifying beauty laid out before me. The garden was not of stone nor plants, but of flesh, human flesh, twisted and sculpted into forms that defied nature and reason. What once might have been men and women had been reshaped into grotesque statues, their bodies stretched, torn and sewn back together in impossible configurations. Limbs extended unnaturally long, bones warped into sickening curves, and skin stretched tight over frames of sinew and muscle, glistening in the dim light. Some hung from the ceiling, suspended by chains, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide with permanent terror. Others were fused together, their bodies woven into intricate displays of suffering and desire, locked forever in a grotesque embrace of pain. Each piece was a masterpiece of agony, each one a testament to the perverse artistry of the Flesh Carvers. This, Nissa gestured grandly to the horrors before me, is our offering to Slaanesh. We take the flesh of the willing, the condemned, the forgotten, and we make them beautiful. We reshape them in his image. I stepped forward, my boots sinking slightly into the pulsing floor beneath me. It wasn't stone at all, but something softer, flesh-like. The garden pulsed, like the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of a living organism. Every wall, every inch of space around me seemed alive, alive and suffering. One of the sculptures caught my eye, a figure once human, but now stretched across a lattice of bone and metal. Its arms had been extended far beyond their natural length, the bones shattered and reset to twist grotesquely. Its face, devoid of any recognizable features, had been smoothed over, leaving only a mouth, a gaping, lipless maw stretched into an eternal scream of silent torment. The skin was pulled so tightly over its body that it looked like it could tear at any moment, the veins pulsing just beneath the surface. I felt something stir inside me, something dark, something twisted. This was no longer just horror. This was art. Nissa stepped beside me, her eyes glinting as she watched my reaction. You feel it, don't you? The power in the pain, the beauty in the suffering. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from the grotesque masterpiece. I could feel the lure of it, the way the warp twisted the flesh into something more than human. The agony carved into the very essence of these poor souls was almost alluring. We give them purpose, she continued. A new existence. They become part of something greater, something eternal. They transcend the limitations of their mortal bodies. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her fingers digging into my skin just hard enough to draw blood. You, too, will create. You will become an artist in Slaanesh's name. Today you will carve. She led me to an altar, and there, laid out before me, was my canvas. The woman strapped to the stone slab was barely recognizable as human anymore. Her skin had been flayed from her limbs, exposing raw, bloody muscle that pulsed with every tremor of pain that racked her body. Her eyes darted wildly, her lips parted in a silent plea for release. But there would be no mercy here. Nissa handed me the ceremonial blade once more, its edge gleaming wickedly in the low light. Carve her, Severith. Shape her into something worthy of Slaanesh's gaze. Give her body purpose beyond mere existence. I hesitated for a brief moment. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the terror there, the desperate hope that I might show her some kindness. But kindness had no place here, not anymore. With a slow, deliberate motion, I placed the blade against her thigh, feeling the tension in her muscles beneath the metal. The first cut was deep, the flesh parting like silk beneath the sharp edge. Blood welled up instantly, spilling over the altar and pooling on the floor. Her body jerked violently, her mouth opening in a scream so raw and agonizing that it seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. But the sound was intoxicating. Each cut was more precise, more deliberate. I worked my way up her leg, carving intricate patterns into her skin, watching as the blood flowed freely, as her muscles twitched and spasmed beneath my hand. The pain was evident, every inch of her body shaking with it. But there was also beauty in it, beauty in the way the flesh tore, in the way the blood glistened on her exposed muscle. As I carved, I felt the power of Slaanesh flowing through me, guiding my hand, whispering in my ear, more. deeper. Let her feel the ecstasy of agony. I reached her torso, slicing cleanly through her abdomen, exposing the glistening organs beneath. Her body bucked violently, the straps holding her down, straining against her movements. But she would not escape. Not until the transformation was complete. I began to peel back the layers of her flesh, stretching her skin tight, weaving it into the framework of bone and sinew I had already created. Her screams filled the chamber, a symphony of torment that echoed off the walls and reverberated through my very bones. But I did not stop. I could not stop. Each cut, each slice of the blade was perfection. The final stroke came when I reached her face. Her eyes, once wide with fear, were now dull, empty, her mind lost to the pain. I carved the last symbol into her forehead, a final mark of devotion to Slaanesh, and as the blood flowed, I felt the ritual complete. Her body, now a grotesque statue of flesh and bone, stood as a testament to the power of suffering. Nissa watched in silence, her lips curling into a smile of approval. You see now, Severith, the true beauty in flesh. I stepped back, my chest heaving, my hands slick with blood. The woman's body was no longer recognizable as human, but it was beautiful, twisted, warped, and glorious in its agony. And I had created it. The ecstasy of creation, the thrill of pain, the power of shaping flesh, it all coursed through me like a fever. I was no longer a mere knight. I was no longer a mere knight. I was an artist, a flesh carver. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Plague of Mousillon. Mousillon was always a city of death, a place where the living clung to life like flies swarming over a rotting corpse. The air stank of decay, the streets were caked in filth, and its people were already half dead, waiting for the final push into the grave. It was the perfect canvas for our work, the perfect city to be devoured by its own rot. When the plague came, it spread like wildfire through the already sick and dying. It clung to the air like a thick miasma, a choking fog that sapped the strength of all who breathed it. The streets filled with the sounds of coughing and retching, the cries of those too far gone to stand, and the endless moaning of those too weak to die quickly. For most, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension, a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. But for us, those who had embraced the Dark Prince, it was opportunity. The first time I saw the plague victims, their skin blistered and rotting as they crawled through the muck of Mal Salon's streets, I felt nothing but contempt. These were the dregs of society, the weak and the broken, those unworthy of Slaanesh's gifts. But Lady Nissa, in her infinite wisdom, saw them differently. They are ripe for transformation, she said, her voice soft but insistent. What better time to expand the garden than now, when the flesh of the city is already dying? They will come to us, begging for release, for salvation, and we will give them what they seek. She was right, of course. The plague turned the city into a hunting ground. Every corner, every alleyway became a feast for us, as the dying crawled out of their homes and into the embrace of the cult. Desperation drove them to us. They clutched at our robes, their eyes wild with fear and fever, begging for mercy, for the pain to end. We did not offer mercy. The first one I took was a merchant, his body ravaged by the sickness, his skin pale and covered in dark, festering boils. His eyes were bloodshot, sunken into his skull as he stumbled toward me, his body bent and broken. "Please," he gasped, his voice thick with mucus, blood dripping from his cracked lips. I need help." I smiled, my hand resting on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at my side. "You've come to the right place." I dragged him to the flesh garden, his body too weak to resist, and strapped him to the stone altar. The plague had already done much of the work for me, softening his skin, making it easier to carve. I could see the rot spreading beneath his flesh, his muscles wasting away, his body collapsing in on itself. But I would not let the plague take him. No, that would be far too merciful. Instead, I gave him purpose. I sliced into him with practiced precision, the blade parting his skin effortlessly. His scream, hoarse and wet, echoed through the chamber, mixing with the groans of the other victims being prepared for their transformation. His blood spilled freely, mixing with the thick, black bile oozing from the sores that covered his body. As I worked, I felt the familiar rush of power, the twisted ecstasy of creation that came with every cut. The plague had softened his flesh, but I hardened it, reshaping his rotting form into something worthy of Slaanesh. His bones were brittle and fragile, so I broke them, twisting them into new, unnatural angles. His skin, covered in festering boils, became the canvas upon which I carved intricate symbols of devotion. His muscles, already withered and weak, I stretched and tore, fusing them with the flesh of other victims, creating a grotesque tapestry of suffering and beauty. His eyes, once filled with terror, glazed over as the pain consumed him. His body, now a twisted monument to agony, shuddered violently with each shallow breath, but he was alive. That was the key. He was still alive, his heart still beating, his lungs still struggling to draw breath. I had made sure of that. When I finished, his body was no longer recognizable as the frail merchant who had begged for help. He had become something more, something transcendent. His limbs were elongated, his skin pulled taut and covered in the symbols of Slaanesh. His bones jutted out from his flesh at odd angles, twisted and reshaped to fit the design. His face, once human, had been reduced to a mask of suffering, his mouth stretched into a permanent scream, his eyes wide and unblinking. I stepped back to admire my work, the rush of power still surging through me. This was art. This was devotion. Lady Nissa watched from the shadows, her eyes gleaming with approval. You see, Severith, the plague is not a curse. It is a blessing. It weakens the body, softens it for us. The flesh is ours to shape, to mold into something beautiful. And they come willingly, seeking salvation. And they did. More came. The streets of Mal Salon were filled with the sick and dying, and we welcomed them all. The flesh garden grew. The bodies of the plague victims reshaped into grotesque statues, living monuments to Slaanesh's glory. Their suffering was endless, their agony eternal, but they had been given purpose. The city continued to rot around us, the stench of decay thick in the air, but we thrived. Every dying soul that staggered into our embrace was another gift to the Dark Prince, another body to be reshaped, another work of art to add to the garden. The plague was not death, it was transformation. It was the perfect tool for our ascension. As I stood among the statues, their tortured forms illuminated by the sickly glow of the candles, I felt a sense of pride. This was my work, my creations. The people of Mal Salon, once weak and broken, had been given a new life, a new purpose. And I had made it possible. But even as I reveled in the power coursing through me, I could feel something else, a darkness creeping at the edges of my mind, whispering promises of greater power, of ascension. The flesh I had carved was only the beginning. I could feel Slaanesh watching, waiting for the next step, the next sacrifice. And I would not disappoint. The plague had turned Mousillon into a city of the dead, but from that death, something beautiful had emerged. The garden was growing, and so was my power, but I could feel it, Slaanesh's gaze, ever watchful, ever hungry. He wanted more, and I would give it to him. The city had not yet seen true suffering. Chapter 5, The Knight's Temptation. The Duke's court was a grotesque mockery of the Bretonnian ideals I once held dear. Where once I had believed in honor, in chivalry and nobility, now I stood before an assembly of decadence and decay. The walls of Duke Maldred's palace were slick with mildew and rot, the air thick with the scent of disease. Yet, amidst the filth, there was a beauty to the suffering, a cruel elegance to the degradation that stirred something deep within me. Lady Nissa had warned me not to trust Maldred. "He is a beast," she had said, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "His ambition knows no bounds, and he would devour you given the chance, but how could I not come?" The Duke's invitation had been more than a mere summons. It had been a challenge, a promise of greater power. He had heard whispers of the flesh garden, of my creations, and now, like a moth drawn to flame, he wanted to see for himself. As I entered the grand hall, I could feel the eyes of the courtiers upon me, their gazes filled with envy, lust, and disdain. They were vermin, clad in the remnants of noble garments, their bodies bloated with disease, their flesh pale and waxy. The plague had ravaged even the highest ranks of Mal Salon, but it had not destroyed their insatiable hunger for power. These creatures, once men and women of prestige, now hungered for the forbidden pleasures that only Slaanesh could offer. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of bone and rotting silk, sat Duke Maldred. His body was a twisted mass of muscle and scar tissue, his face a ruin of grotesque mutations that spoke of decades of corruption. His eyes, however, gleamed with a predatory intelligence. He smiled as I approached, a thin, cruel smile that stretched the misshapen flesh of his cheeks. "Severith," he said, his voice a deep, rasping growl. The artist of flesh himself, gracing my court with his presence. I knelt before him, though the gesture felt hollow, almost ironic. Maldred was no true lord. He was a monster, a creature warped by his own excesses, just as I was becoming. "Rise," he commanded, gesturing with one bloated hand. "I have heard much of your work, Severith. They say your creations rival even the horrors of chaos itself." I stood, meeting his gaze, my hand resting on the hilt of my blade. "My work is not meant for your entertainment, Duke," the first said, my voice cold. "It is an offering to Slaanesh." Maldred chuckled, a wet, gurgling sound that made the courtiers around him flinch. Of course," he said, "and yet we both know that Slaanesh rewards those who serve themselves just as much as those who serve him." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I could give you more than just this wretched city. Join me, Severith. Show me the true depths of your art, and together we could turn Bretonnia into a kingdom of flesh and pleasure. Imagine it, a land where every soul is a canvas for your blade." His words sank deep into my mind, coiling around my thoughts like a serpent. The temptation was real. Power beyond imagining, the chance to reshape the world itself, to carve my name into the very bones of Bretonnia. I could feel Slaanesh watching, waiting, testing my resolve. And yet there was something about Maldred that repulsed me. He was weak, bloated with ambition, but lacking the refinement of true devotion. He sought only pleasure for himself, not the glory of Slaanesh. Still, I could not deny that his offer stirred something dark within me. "What do you ask of me, Duke?" the first said. My voice measured. Maldred's smile widened, revealing rows of sharpened teeth. "A simple task for one such as you. I want you to transform my most loyal advisor, Sir Baldan, into a work of art, just as you have done with your other victims." Sir Baldan stepped forward from the shadows, a hulking figure clad in rusted armor. His face was hidden beneath a helmet, but I could feel his eyes burning into me, filled with hatred and defiance. "He is yours to shape," Maldred said, his voice dripping with malice. "Take him. Make him beautiful." I felt a surge of excitement at the challenge. Baldan was no weak, dying plague victim. He was strong, filled with life, and he would resist every cut, every slice of the blade. I could already imagine the possibilities, the ways I could stretch his flesh, break his bones, twist him into something both magnificent and terrible. Without a word, I approached Baldan, my blade glinting in the dim light of the hall. He tensed, his muscles rippling beneath his armor, but he did not move. He would not give me the satisfaction of fear. I struck swiftly, the blade slicing through his armor like butter, carving a deep gash across his chest. Blood sprayed from the wound, splattering the floor in a thick, crimson arc. Baldan grunted but did not cry out. I smiled, relishing the challenge. I slashed again, this time severing the straps of his armor, exposing the pale flesh beneath. His chest was broad and muscular, his skin unmarked by the corruption of Mousillon. But not for long. I dug the blade deep into his abdomen, twisting it as I carved through muscle and sinew. His body jerked, his fists clenched, but still he remained silent. Blood poured from the wound, soaking the floor beneath us. I could hear the courtiers murmuring in delight, their twisted minds reveling in the spectacle of pain. With each cut I reshaped him, my hands moving with the precision of a master sculptor. His flesh tore beneath my blade, but I did not stop. I sliced through muscle, peeled back layers of skin, revealing the raw, pulsing tissue beneath. His bones cracked under the force of my strikes, his body warping as I carved new patterns into his flesh. Baldan finally let out a roar of pain as I severed his tendons, his legs buckling beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself together. But I was not finished. I grabbed his face, forcing his head back as I carved a jagged line across his forehead. His eyes, once burning with defiance, now filled with agony. Blood streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and grime that clung to his skin. "Beautiful," I whispered, my breath hot against his ear. "You will be my masterpiece." I slashed across his face, cutting deep into the muscle, peeling the skin away in long, jagged strips. His screams echoed through the hall, his body convulsing with each cut. Blood dripped from my hands, pooling around my feet, but I did not stop. I could feel Slaanesh's presence in every stroke, the Dark Prince guiding my hand, whispering promises of power in my ear. I twisted Baldan's flesh, reshaping him into something new, something divine. His bones cracked and reformed, his skin stretched taut over exposed muscle, his eyes wide with pain and terror. When I was finished, Baldan was no longer a man. He was a living sculpture of agony, his body twisted and reshaped into a grotesque monument to suffering. His face was a mask of horror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, his body trembling as he struggled to remain alive. I stepped back, admiring my work, my heart pounding with exhilaration. This was art. This was devotion. The hall was silent, the courtiers watching in awe, their eyes wide with admiration and fear. Maldred clapped slowly, his smile broadening. "Well done, Severith," he said, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. "You truly are an artist." But even as he praised me, I felt a cold emptiness settling in my chest. Maldred was a fool, unworthy of the power he sought to wield. He did not understand the true purpose of suffering, the beauty and the pain. He was weak, and I knew then that I would not serve him. I would surpass him. I would carve my name into the bones of this city, and then I would carve my way to something far greater. For Slaanesh was watching, and I would give him everything. Chapter 6: The Carving of Souls. The air was thick with the stench of blood and burnt flesh, hanging over the flesh garden like a shroud. The remnants of my latest work glistened in the dim light, flesh still twitching, but silent. Sir Baldan, once a proud warrior, was now little more than a ruined monument to pain, his once imposing body twisted into an unrecognizable mass of sinew and bone. Yet, despite my creation, the hunger still gnawed at me. The blade in my hand, now soaked in the blood of countless victims, felt too light. I craved more flesh to shape, more agony to etch into the fabric of reality. But even as I reveled in my power, I could feel Slaanesh's gaze on me, ever watchful, ever demanding. I had given much, but I knew the Dark Prince required more than mere bodies. He craved souls. The thought burned in my mind, twisting it, filling me with an obsessive desire that I could not ignore. Flesh was only the beginning. There were depths yet unplumbed, and I would delve into them. I would not merely carve bodies, I would carve the very essence of my victims. Their souls would fuel my rise, and in doing so, I would ascend closer to Slaanesh's favor. Lady Nissa sensed the shift in me. She approached, her face a mask of serene pleasure, but I could see the flicker of unease behind her eyes. She knew what was coming. "Severith, you grow restless," she purred, her voice as soft and poisonous as always. "The power you crave, it is dangerous. You risk everything by pursuing it." I turned to her, the blade in my hand still dripping blood. "What do you know of danger, Nissa? You hide in the shadows while I shape this world in Slaanesh's name. I am no longer content with mere flesh. The prince demands more. The souls of men, women, knights are the true canvas now." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment. "And you think you can capture a soul, Severith? The soul is not flesh. It cannot be carved with mere steel." I stepped closer, my heart thudding with a cruel excitement. "The soul is tied to the body, Nissa. It feels pain. It reacts to suffering. When I carve deep enough, I see it, the shimmer in their eyes when they break, when they surrender completely. It can be done. And you will witness it." Without waiting for her reply, I called for the cultists to bring the next sacrifice, an unsuspecting knight of Bretonnia who had been captured wandering too close to our borders. His armor was battered but still bore the emblem of the Lady of the Lake, his honor like a foul stench that clung to him, even as he was dragged, bruised and beaten, into the flesh garden. I circled him, watching as he struggled against his bonds, his eyes burning with defiance, even as blood dripped from his lips. His name was Sir Guillaume, and he had come to Mal Salon seeking redemption for some forgotten sin. How poetic that his redemption would instead lead to his undoing. "Do you know what lies before you, Sir Guillaume?" I asked, my voice low and mocking. He spat blood onto the ground, glaring up at me with hate in his eyes. "You are filth," he growled. "A traitor. A monster. The lady will strike you down." I chuckled softly, my fingers tracing the edge of the ceremonial blade. "Perhaps, but you won't live to see it." I turned to the gathered cultists. "Bind him to the altar." They obeyed without question, their movements quick and efficient. Sir Guillaume was forced onto the cold stone slab, his arms and legs stretched taut by iron chains. He fought, of course, muscles bulging beneath his skin as he strained against his bonds, but it was futile. The moment he was laid bare before me, the ritual began. I pressed the blade to his chest, savoring the hiss of steel against skin. His body tensed as I made the first cut, a shallow line down the center of his chest. Blood welled up from the wound, but it was not the blood I sought. No, I was after something much deeper. I carved slowly, methodically, my blade working its way through muscle and tissue with sickening ease. The agony was evident in his face, his teeth gritted, sweat pouring down his brow, but he did not scream. Not yet. That was always the hardest part, the moment when the soul resisted. But I was patient. The breaking would come. I split his flesh wider, exposing ribs, the muscles tearing like wet cloth as I worked. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with pain, but he still fought to maintain his composure. The chains rattled as his body convulsed, his fingers clawing at the air, grasping for salvation that would never come. And then, as the blade cut deep enough to scrape against bone, I saw it, the flicker in his eyes, that faint shimmer that betrayed the soul's vulnerability. He gasped, and in that instant, his soul screamed louder than any mortal cry. I drove the blade deeper, slicing through the muscle to expose his beating heart, and with it his soul. His body jerked violently, the sound of his ribs cracking under the pressure filling the chamber. His blood, thick and dark, sprayed across my arms, but I didn't stop. I carved deeper, my hands slick with gore, as the soul itself seemed to writhe within the confines of his tortured flesh. And then he screamed. It was a sound unlike any other, a primal, guttural wail that tore from the depths of his being. His body convulsed, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth stretched open in a scream so raw it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the chamber. The cultist recoiled in fear, but I reveled in it. This was the moment. The soul was mine. I leaned in, my breath hot against his mutilated chest. Do you feel it, Sir Guillaume? The pain beyond the body? The soul itself screaming in agony. His eyes, once filled with defiance, now held only terror. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only a choked sob as his spirit began to unravel before me. With one final, brutal stroke, I sliced through the connection between body and soul. The blade cut deep into his heart, and I felt it, the soul tearing free, the last vestiges of life ripped from his flesh. His body spasmed, his limbs jerking violently as the soul broke, splintering into the warp of the final, agonizing scream. For a brief moment, the world seemed to shudder. The air grew thick with the scent of the warp, the fabric of reality itself rippling as Slaanesh's presence washed over me. I had done it. I had carved not just his body but his very soul, offering it to the Dark Prince. I stepped back, my hands dripping with blood, my heart pounding with exhilaration. The chamber was silent, save for the soft, dying breaths of Sir Guillaume's ruined body. Lady Nissa watched in stunned silence, her face pale with awe and horror. You have done it," she whispered. "You have carved his soul." I smiled, the weight of my power settling over me like a cloak. "This is only the beginning, Nissa. Slaanesh demands more than mere flesh, and I will give it to him." I glanced down at Sir Guillaume's broken form, his eyes still wide with the horror of his final moments, his body a lifeless husk. I had transcended the flesh. Now I would carve my way to the souls of Bretonnia itself. The path to daemonhood was clear, and I would take it no matter the cost. Chapter 7: The Descent of Nissa. Nissa's descent began long before she ever raised her hand against me, but it wasn't until that fateful night in the Flesh Garden that I truly understood how far she had fallen. The air hung heavy with the scent of blood and decay, thick enough to taste on my tongue. The garden was a grotesque masterpiece, the twisted forms of the plague victims standing in eternal torment, their bodies carved and reshaped into grotesque works of art. The soft sounds of their agony, the shuddering breaths, the wet gurgle of ruptured organs, were a constant melody, a hymn of suffering to the Dark Prince. I stood in the center of it all, admiring my latest work. The body of Sir Guillaume, now reduced to a lifeless, hollowed-out shell, lay before me, his soul long since torn from the flesh. I could still feel the echoes of his screams, the way his soul had writhed as I carved it free. It had been a glorious act, the first true offering to Slaanesh that transcended mere flesh. And yet, something gnawed at me, something dark and brooding, like a storm on the horizon. Lady Nissa watched me from the shadows, her eyes sharp, her movements slow and deliberate. I could sense the tension radiating from her, the jealousy and fear that festered in her heart. She had seen what I had done, witnessed the power I now held, and it terrified her. For so long, Nissa had been the one to guide me, to shape me into the artist of flesh I had become. But now she was slipping. The Dark Prince had chosen me as his favored, and Nissa could feel her power waning. She had once been the embodiment of Slaanesh's will in Mal Salon, but now I was rising to take her place. And she couldn't bear it. I sensed her approach before she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was an edge to it, a razor hidden beneath the silk. "You've grown bold, Severith," she said, stepping out of the shadows. "Too bold." I turned to face her, the blade still slick with blood in my hand. "Boldness is rewarded by Slaanesh," I replied, my voice steady. "It was you who taught me that." Her lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Perhaps I did. But you forget your place, Severith. I brought you into this. I made you what you are. And now I have surpassed you. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with barely concealed rage. Surpassed me, she hissed. You think because you carved a soul that you are beyond my reach? You are nothing without me. She moved quickly, faster than I had anticipated, her hand lashing out to strike me. But I was ready. I caught her wrist mid-swing, my grip tightening until I heard the bones crack beneath my fingers. She winced, but she didn't scream. Don't make the mistake of thinking I fear you, Nissa. I growled, my voice low and threatening. You may have brought me into this world, but I will carve my way out of it. Her eyes blazed with fury, and in that moment I saw it, the madness lurking just beneath the surface. Her once beautiful face, now twisted with anger, seemed to ripple, her skin tightening and pulling as if the flesh itself was trying to escape the corruption within. She wrenched her hand free and stepped back, her chest heaving with barely contained rage. You think you can take my place, she spat, her voice venomous. You think Slaanesh favors you over me. I know it, I said calmly, wiping the blood from the blade. And so do you. Her face contorted into a mask of hatred, her once flawless features twisting and warping. It was subtle at first, a ripple beneath her skin, but then it spread, her flesh shifting, stretching unnaturally, as if her body was tearing itself apart from the inside. I could hear the sickening sound of bones cracking, muscles snapping, as her form twisted into something monstrous. I had seen this before, of course. The Flesh Carvers were no strangers to mutation, but Nissa's transformation was something different, something far more grotesque. Her skin tore open in places, revealing raw, pulsing muscle beneath, glistening with blood and ichor. Her arms elongated, the bones jutting at unnatural angles, her fingers growing into long, razor-sharp talons. Her face, once beautiful, split down the middle, her mouth widening into a gaping maw filled with jagged, needle-like teeth. You will not take what is mine, she shrieked, her voice now an inhuman, guttural growl. I watched in awe and revulsion as her body continued to twist and warp, the flesh splitting and reforming, her bones breaking and resetting over and over again. She was becoming something else, something more than human. But in her desperation to retain power, she had lost herself. Nissa had always preached the balance between pleasure and pain, between beauty and horror. But now she was nothing but a mindless beast, consumed by her own ambition and fear. I stepped back, raising the blade in my hand. You've lost yourself, Nissa. Slaanesh no longer wants you. Her eyes, now dark, hollow pits, locked onto me, and with a snarl she lunged. I moved quickly, sidestepping her attack. Her talons swiped through the air, slicing deep into the stone walls with a screech that echoed through the chamber. Blood and ichor dripped from her gaping wounds, but she didn't seem to notice, her monstrous form driven by pure rage. She lunged again, but this time I was ready. I drove the blade deep into her chest, piercing her mutated flesh. The scream that tore from her throat was not one of pain, but of pure, unrelenting fury. She thrashed violently, her body convulsing as the blade sank deeper, blood pouring from the wound in thick, black streams. With a roar, she tore the blade free, the wound in her chest gaping open, her insides spilling onto the floor in a grotesque cascade of blood, organs, and shattered bones. Yet still she did not fall. Her body twisted and buckled, her flesh rippling as she tried to heal, to reform. But it was too late. She had lost control, and now her body was nothing but a ruined, twisted mass of agony and mutation. I stepped forward, the knife still slick with her blood. This is what you've become, Nissa. A twisted reflection of the power you once held. Her monstrous eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of the woman she had once been, just a glimmer of the pride and ambition that had driven her. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the wild, savage hunger that now ruled her. With a swift, final motion, I brought the blade down, severing her head from her shoulders. Blood sprayed across the chamber, coating the walls in a thick, dark mist as her body crumpled to the ground, lifeless at last. I stood over her mutilated form, my chest heaving, my heart pounding with exhilaration. Nissa was gone. The path was clear. And I was now the master of the Flesh Carvers. Chapter 8: The Siege of Mousillon. The walls of Mousillon bled. The crumbling stone, slick with rain and ichor, seemed to groan under the weight of the approaching Bretonnian army. The sound of war drums thundered from beyond the mists, the rhythmic pounding a constant reminder of what was to come. They had come to destroy us, these so-called knights of honor, to cleanse the city of its rot and filth. But they didn't understand. They could never understand what Mousillon had become, what I had become. The flesh garden thrived within these walls. It pulsated with life, with agony, with the twisted beauty that only Slaanesh could inspire. The bodies of those who had fallen to the plague had been reshaped, remade into grotesque sculptures that adorned the city's streets like nightmarish monuments. And now, as the knights prepared to lay siege to this cursed place, I stood among my creations, feeling the power of the Dark Prince coursing through me. Mousillon would not fall. Not to them. Severith, one of the cultists, a wiry man whose skin was stretched so tight across his bones that he looked like a living corpse, spoke from behind me. His voice was trembling with excitement. "The knights are close. We have prepared as you commanded." I turned to face him, my gaze drifting over the twisted figures that made up my army. The cultists had taken to the ritual with glee, their bodies now barely recognizable as human. They were the perfect servants, their flesh carved and reshaped into instruments of Slaanesh's will. Limbs had been elongated into grotesque weapons, bones jutted out from their bodies like natural armor, and their faces, their faces were works of art, twisted into permanent expressions of ecstasy and torment. "Good," I said, my voice calm despite the chaos brewing outside the city walls. "Let them come. We will show them the true meaning of suffering." The pounding of the war drums grew louder, and from the parapet, I could see the first ranks of the Bretonnian knights emerge from the fog. Their shining armor, once symbols of purity and valor, now looked dull and tarnished against the backdrop of the cursed land. I could see their banners fluttering in the wind, the sigils of their noble houses barely visible through the rain. They came in force, thousands of knights and men at arms, their faces set in grim determination. But determination would not be enough. I had reshaped this city in Slaanesh's image. It was no longer bound by the laws of men or gods. It was alive, pulsating with the energy of the warp. The very streets writhed beneath the feet of the invaders, the stones slick with blood and bile, and the buildings groaned as if they too felt the presence of the enemy. From the parapet, I raised my hand, signaling the cultists below. They moved quickly, scurrying like rats through the streets to take their positions. Their bodies, mutated and grotesque, blended into the flesh walls and twisted structures I had created. The flesh garden had become our battlefield, and they would defend it with every drop of blood, every inch of torn muscle. The first wave of knights charged, their lances lowered, their horses' hooves pounding the earth as they raced toward the city gates. I watched them come, my heart thrumming with dark anticipation. The knights believed in their honor, their faith in the Lady of the Lake, but that faith would falter when they faced what lay beyond the gates. With a sharp motion of my hand, the gates of Mousillon creaked open, revealing the horrors inside. The knights faltered for a moment, their charge slowing as they beheld the flesh garden in all its grotesque glory. Twisted bodies, once human, now writhed and convulsed on the walls, their flesh stitched together in intricate patterns that both horrified and fascinated. Eyes, wide with terror, stared out from the walls, mouths twisted into silent screams as their bodies remained trapped in eternal torment. But the knights had no time to react. The cultists surged from the gates, their mutated forms crashing into the ranks of Bretonnian knights with a sickening crunch. Flesh met steel in a brutal, bloody collision. I could hear the screams of the knights as they were torn from their saddles, their armor ripped apart by the twisted claws and jagged bones of my followers. Blood sprayed across the battlefield, staining the ground red, as bodies were shredded and broken. One knight, his armor gleaming with the emblem of the lady, charged toward me, his sword raised high. His face was set in grim determination, but I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. He was afraid of what I had become, of what I represented. I waited for him, my blade in hand, my body thrumming with power. He brought his sword down in a wide arc, but I was faster. I stepped to the side, driving my blade into the gap between his armor, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone as the steel pierced his flesh. He gasped, blood pouring from his mouth, but I wasn't finished. I twisted the blade, carving through muscle and sinew, my hands slick with gore. His body convulsed, his limbs jerking uncontrollably as I drove the blade deeper, feeling the resistance of bone snapping beneath the pressure. With one final, brutal motion, I tore the sword free, and the knight collapsed at my feet, his blood pooling around my boots. I glanced around the battlefield, the smell of blood and death filling the air. The knights were being slaughtered, their bodies torn apart by the ravenous cultists. The ground was littered with corpses, limbs severed, heads rolling through the mud. The flesh garden itself seemed to pulse with life, feeding on the carnage, the walls glistening with fresh blood as the souls of the fallen were absorbed into the city. But it wasn't enough. Slaanesh demanded more pain, more suffering. The slaughter was glorious, but it was only the beginning. I raised my hand once more, signaling the next wave. The gates of Mousillon shuddered as the ground beneath them erupted, twisted forms of flesh and bone rising from the depths of the city. These were my true creations, the result of countless hours spent reshaping the bodies of the dead and dying. Hulking abominations, their flesh melded together in grotesque configurations, their limbs too long, their mouths filled with rows of jagged teeth. They moved with unnatural speed, crashing into the ranks of the knights like a tidal wave of flesh and bone. The knights, brave as they were, stood no chance. The abominations tore through them with ease, their massive hands ripping knights from their horses, crushing their armor like paper. Blood sprayed in every direction, and the screams of the knights filled the air, a chorus of agony that echoed across the battlefield. I watched, my heart racing with exhilaration, as the abominations tore through the Bretonnian forces. This was my victory, my creation. Mal Salon would not fall to these fools. The flesh garden would grow, and with it, my power. As I stood amidst the carnage, I could feel Slaanesh's presence, the Dark Prince's gaze upon me. The ecstasy of the slaughter, the beauty of the violence, it was all for him. And I knew, in that moment, that I had earned his favor. Mal Salon would not fall. Not today. Not ever. For I was the artist of flesh, and the city was my canvas. And with each death, with each scream of agony, my masterpiece grew. Chapter 9, The Dance of Blades. The battlefield had become a living nightmare, a cacophony of screams, steel and wet, tearing flesh. Mousillon's streets, once narrow alleys choked with filth and rot, now ran thick with blood. The knights of Bretonnia, once so proud and noble, were little more than broken husks beneath the weight of our onslaught. Their polished armor, their shining sigils, all were smeared with gore, their noble visages turned into twisted masks of agony as my followers, the Flesh Carvers, carved their way through them with a frenzy that could only be described as ecstatic. I was at the heart of it, of course, where I belonged. The Dance of Blades, they would call it, if anyone lived to tell the tale. But there would be no survivors. There would only be me, the blade, and the endless symphony of death that I conducted with every stroke. The knights came at me in waves, their lances and swords gleaming in the dim, blood-soaked light. They moved as a unit, desperate to reclaim some semblance of order amidst the chaos, but they were nothing against the power coursing through my veins. I had become something more than mortal, something more than human. Slaanesh flowed through me like fire, burning away my past, leaving behind only the ecstasy of combat, the thrill of the kill. The first knight to reach me swung his sword with all the strength his dying body could muster. I moved before he even realized it, my blade flashing in a perfect arc, slicing clean through the steel of his helm, the flesh of his neck parting as easily as silk. Blood sprayed in a crimson arc as his head tumbled to the ground, the body crumpling lifelessly behind it. There was no pause, no hesitation. As soon as his body fell, I was already moving again, my movements fluid and graceful, each step a dance, each strike a perfectly timed beat in the bloody symphony. Another knight charged at me, his lance aimed straight for my heart. I spun, my blade meeting the shaft of the lance, splintering it into pieces. His eyes widened with shock, just as I stepped inside his guard, plunging my sword deep into his chest. I felt the satisfying crunch of ribs breaking beneath my blade, felt the warm gush of blood as his heart was pierced. The knight's scream was brief, cut short as I twisted the blade and wrenched it free, pulling with it a spray of gore that coated my face. I could taste it, the iron tang of his life force, and it filled me with a savage joy. Another knight fell, and then another. They tried to surround me, to overwhelm me with sheer numbers, but it was pointless. I was not merely fighting them. I was dancing with them, leading them through a grotesque waltz of death. Each step, each strike, was a work of art, every scream a note in the melody of slaughter. I spun through the chaos, my blade singing as it cut through flesh and steel alike. Limbs were severed, torsos cleaved in two, skulls split open in perfect, graceful strokes. I was the master of this battlefield, my movements precise, my strikes lethal. The knights were nothing more than puppets in my hands, their bodies crumbling beneath the weight of my power. The ground beneath me was slick with blood, my boots slipping in the muck as I danced across the battlefield, never stopping, never slowing. My body hummed with energy, my muscles alive with the thrill of the fight. Each death fed me, each scream filled me with a dark, twisted pleasure that only Slaanesh could provide. And the more I killed, the more beautiful it became. One knight, braver or more foolish than the others, charged at me, his sword held high. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the way his lips trembled as he muttered a prayer to his lady. It was almost pitiful. I let him swing first, ducking beneath his blade with ease. My own sword followed immediately, slicing cleanly through the back of his knee. He screamed as he collapsed to the ground, his leg useless, blood spurting from the wound. But I wasn't finished. I circled him, watching as he struggled to crawl away, his hands clawing at the blood-soaked earth. I could hear him praying again, begging for mercy, for salvation. There would be none. With a swift motion, I brought my blade down, severing his spine. His body went limp, his screams dying in his throat as his life drained away. I moved on without a second thought. Another night, another life to claim. The battlefield had become my stage, and the knights were my audience. Each death was a performance, each kill a masterpiece in the making. My blade sang through the air, carving through flesh and bone with an elegance that could only come from the power of the Dark Prince. But even as I danced through the carnage, I could feel something changing within me. My body, once merely human, was shifting, warping beneath the strain of the power flowing through me. My skin felt tight, stretched over muscles that bulged unnaturally. My bones ached, creaking under the weight of the mutation that clawed at my flesh. I welcomed it. Each kill, each cut, brought me closer to the ascension I craved. I could feel Slaanesh watching, could feel the Dark Prince's eyes on me as I tore through the nights, their bodies falling like leaves in the wind. The power was intoxicating, flooding my veins with fire, pushing me beyond the limits of my mortal form. My skin began to split, the flesh tearing in jagged lines as the mutation took hold. But it was not pain that I felt. No, what I felt was pleasure. The ecstasy of transformation, of becoming something more than human, something greater. My bones cracked and reformed, my muscles tearing and knitting themselves back together in twisted, grotesque configurations. I could hear the knights shouting, their voices filled with terror as they watched me change before their eyes. But they were powerless to stop it. I was beyond them now, beyond pain, beyond fear. I let out a roar, a sound that was no longer entirely human, as I plunged my blade into the chest of another knight. His body convulsed, his blood spraying in hot, thick streams as I tore the sword free, his heart still impaled on the tip of the blade. The dance continued, faster and more frenzied now. I moved with a speed and grace that was unnatural, my body no longer bound by the limitations of flesh. I was a blur of steel and blood, my sword cutting through the knights with brutal efficiency. They fell before me, their bodies piling up at my feet, their screams echoing across the battlefield. And through it all, I laughed. I laughed as their blood soaked the earth, as their bodies were torn apart, as the power of Slaanesh coursed through me, transforming me into something beyond mortal comprehension. The dance would not stop. The dance could never stop. For I was no longer Severith, the Knight of Bretonnia. I was something far more beautiful, far more terrible. I was the blade of Slaanesh, and Mal Salon would be my canvas, painted in the blood of my enemies. Chapter 10, The Price of Perfection. My body screamed for release as the power of Slaanesh twisted and warped me from within. Each breath was agony, yet every pulse of pain sent shivers of pleasure coursing through my veins. Flesh, once merely mortal, strained against the forces reshaping it, sinew and bone bending to the Dark Prince's will. I had sought perfection in the art of flesh, and now I was paying its price. The battlefield, once filled with the chaotic dance of combat, was now eerily still. The Bretonnian knights lay in grotesque heaps, their bodies torn apart, their armor shattered and stained with blood. My followers, the Flesh Carvers, stood victorious, their own forms twisted by the blessings of Slaanesh, their hands slick with the gore of their enemies. But there was no triumph in my heart, only hunger. My own body was changing, flesh ripping open in jagged tears, bones cracking and reforming with each agonizing step. I felt the mutation spreading, clawing through my muscles, pulling me closer to daemonhood, but the ecstasy that had fueled my rise was giving way to something darker. Desperation. I stood alone in the heart of the battlefield, my skin pulling tight over the muscles that bulged unnaturally beneath it. My arms had grown, the muscles now grotesque, veins bulging and throbbing with unnatural power. My hands, once human, had become claws, jagged, sharp, and dripping with the blood of those I had slain. I felt my back arch, vertebrae pushing through the flesh, snapping and twisting, as if trying to escape the prison of my mortal shell. Each movement sent waves of torment through my body, but I did not resist it. This was the path I had chosen. This was the price of perfection. The flesh garden pulsed around me, the twisted statues of once human forms writhing in endless torment. They were my creations, my works of art, but now they mocked me with their grotesque beauty. I had spent so long shaping the flesh of others, carving them into testaments to Slaanesh's power, but now it was my own flesh that was being reshaped, and I had no control over it. I could feel the eyes of my followers on me, their gazes filled with both awe and fear. They had seen me ascend, had witnessed the transformation that Slaanesh had bestowed upon me, but they did not understand the agony that accompanied it. They only saw the power, the beauty. But beauty was a lie. I fell to my knees, the stone beneath me slick with blood. My fingers clawed at the ground, pulling deep furrows into the earth as my body continued to twist and mutate. I could feel my spine lengthening, the bones snapping and realigning, my skin stretching to accommodate the new form that Slaanesh demanded. My face, I could feel it pulling, the skin tearing as bones pushed forward, warping into something monstrous. My jaw cracked, elongating into a maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. My eyes burned with the fire of the warp, my vision blurring as reality itself seemed to warp and twist around me. I let out a guttural roar, half human, half demonic, as my body spasmed violently. The pain was overwhelming, a fire that consumed me from the inside out. My muscles tore apart, only to knit themselves back together, stronger and more grotesque than before. My bones grew, pushing through the flesh in jagged, unnatural angles. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. I had carved my way through Mousillon, shaped flesh and soul alike in the name of Slaanesh. I had danced in the blood of my enemies, felt the ecstasy of their suffering, but now, at the precipice of daemonhood, I realized that perfection was a lie. It was a hunger that could never be satisfied, a thirst that could never be quenched. Slaanesh, I howled, my voice cracking with pain and desperation. You promised me power. You promised me perfection. The sky above me roiled, dark clouds swirling as if the heavens themselves were mocking me. I could feel Slaanesh's presence, ever watchful, ever demanding. But there was no answer, only silence. The mutations continued to spread, my body becoming a twisted mockery of what it once was. My arms, now too long and grotesque, hung at my sides, the claws scraping the ground. My spine jutted out from my back in sharp, jagged spikes, tearing through my flesh with every movement. My legs had twisted and contorted, bending in unnatural angles, forcing me to walk in a hunched, animalistic gait. I had become a monster. And yet, through the pain, through the agony, I could feel it, the power of Slaanesh. It thrummed beneath my skin, pulsating through my veins like a drug. Each cut, each tear, each mutation was a gift from the Dark Prince, a reminder of what I had become. But it was also a reminder of what I had lost. I could no longer feel the joy of the kill, the pleasure of the blade sinking into flesh. My mind was consumed by the need for more, the insatiable hunger for perfection that drove me to madness. And that was the final truth. There was no perfection. No matter how much flesh I carved, no matter how many souls I claimed, it would never be enough. I would never be enough. A figure approached through the haze of pain and blood, one of my followers, her body twisted and grotesque, her face a mask of devotion and terror. She knelt before me, her hands trembling as she offered me the ceremonial blade I had used so many times before. "Master," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. "The city is yours. We have won. But what will become of us?" I took the blade from her, my hand shaking as I gripped the hilt. The metal was cold, slick with blood, and I could see my own reflection in its surface, warped, monstrous, a reflection of the madness that had consumed me. What would become of us? There was only one answer. We would continue to serve. We would continue to carve, to shape, to destroy. There was no end to it, no victory, only the endless cycle of pain and pleasure, of creation and destruction. I looked down at the follower, her eyes wide with fear and adoration, and without a word I plunged the blade into her chest. The sound of the blade cutting through flesh was familiar, comforting. Her body convulsed, her blood spilling onto the ground, but there was no ecstasy in her death. Only emptiness. I pulled the blade free, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hunger inside me screamed for more, demanded more blood, more pain, more suffering. But I knew, deep down, that it would never be enough. Perfection was a lie, and I had paid the price. Chapter 11, The Final Sacrifice. The flesh garden was alive, throbbing, pulsing with power and agony. Every surface writhed with the suffering of my creations, the twisted, mutilated forms of those who had once been human now contorted into grotesque monuments to Slaanesh's glory. Their cries, once filled with pain, had long since become a ceaseless, haunting hymn of devotion to the Dark Prince. Yet even amidst this tapestry of torment, I felt nothing but emptiness. Perfection had slipped from my grasp. No matter how many bodies I shaped, no matter how many souls I carved, the hunger inside me only grew, gnawing at the edges of my mind like a festering wound. And now, with Mousillon streets running red with the blood of the Bretonnian knights, I had no more enemies to slaughter, no more canvas upon which to etch my twisted art. Except for myself. I stood at the heart of the garden, the stone altar slick with blood and ichor, my body still trembling from the mutations that had ravaged it. My skin hung loosely over swollen, bulging muscles, torn in places where bones had pushed through. I was no longer fully human, but neither was I fully daemon. My form was a grotesque blend of both, a living testament to the price of Slaanesh's gifts. And yet it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I could feel him watching, Slaanesh, the dark prince of pleasure and pain, waiting, testing my resolve. He had given me everything: power, beauty, the thrill of battle. But there was one final sacrifice left to make. Myself. Myself. The blade in my hand trembled as I raised it to my chest. Its edge gleamed in the sickly light of the garden, still wet with the blood of those I had slain. My followers stood around me, their bodies twisted and deformed, their faces masks of reverence and awe. They whispered my name, their voices trembling with devotion, but I barely heard them. My focus was on the blade and the promise it held. The final offering. The first cut was deep. The blade sank into my flesh without hesitation, parting skin and muscle in a long, jagged line down the center of my chest. Blood poured from the wound in thick, hot streams, staining the altar beneath me. The pain was immediate, sharp and searing, but with it came a rush of pleasure so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. I gasped, my body convulsing as the sensations warred within me, pain and ecstasy, agony and delight. This was the final gift. I carved deeper, the blade slicing through my ribs, each stroke a brutal, deliberate act of devotion. I could feel my heart pounding against the edge of the blade, each beat growing weaker, more ragged. My blood flowed freely, pooling at my feet, but I didn't stop. The pain, the pleasure, it was all consuming, filling every corner of my mind, drowning out everything but the rhythmic pulse of the blade cutting through flesh. My followers watched in silent awe, their eyes wide with horror and reverence as I carved my own body apart. They had seen me shape others, had witnessed the beauty of their suffering, but now they saw the ultimate act of creation, the moment when the artist became the art. My blood splattered across their faces, but they did not flinch. They understood. They knew this was the final step. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to my knees before the altar, my vision blurring as blood loss took its toll. I could feel my life slipping away, my heart struggling to beat, but the ecstasy was overwhelming. Every nerve in my body was on fire, every inch of my flesh alight with the pleasure of the final sacrifice. I tore the blade through my abdomen, splitting myself open, my entrails spilling onto the ground in a sickening, wet heap. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared down at the ruin of my body, watching in twisted fascination as the life drained from me. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. With the last of my strength, I plunged the blade deep into my chest, piercing my heart. The pain was indescribable, a wave of fire and ice that consumed me entirely. My body convulsed violently, blood spraying from the wound, coating the altar and the garden in a final, glorious testament to my devotion. The world around me began to fade. the voices of my followers growing distant as darkness closed in. But even as my vision dimmed, I could feel Slaanesh's presence, closer now than ever before. He was watching, waiting. And I knew that I had done it. I had given him everything. As the last vestiges of life slipped away, I felt the transformation begin. The ground beneath me trembled, the air crackling with dark energy. My body, broken and mutilated, was lifted from the altar, suspended by unseen forces as the power of the warp flooded into me. My flesh twisted and reformed, bones snapping and rearranging as I was remade in Slaanesh's image. My heart, once mortal, now beat with the pulse of the warp itself. My skin, torn and bloody, shimmered with an unnatural light, healing even as it reshaped into something far more beautiful, something far more terrifying. My claws, once crude instruments of violence, grew longer, sharper, gleaming with an otherworldly sheen. My face, once a twisted reflection of my former self, now bore the mark of Slaanesh, my eyes burning with his fire. I had become something more than human, more than a knight, more than a mere servant of the Dark Prince. I had become his. The final sacrifice had been made, and I had ascended. The power coursed through me, intoxicating, overwhelming. My followers fell to their knees, their eyes wide with awe and terror as they beheld my new form. They had served me, worshipped me, but now they saw the truth. I was no longer their leader. I was their god. I looked down at them, my gaze cold and detached. Their devotion had brought them here, but they were nothing to me now, mere tools, playthings for my amusement. I had given everything to Slaanesh, and in return he had made me perfect. But perfection, I now realized, came at a cost. As I stood amidst the ruin of my body, amidst the twisted remains of the flesh garden, I felt the weight of my ascension settling over me. The hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but it no longer drove me. I had transcended it, become something far beyond the petty desires of flesh and blood. I was Severith no longer. I was Daemon Prince of Slaanesh, the ultimate expression of pain and pleasure, the final testament to the Dark Prince's will. And Mousillon would burn in my name. Chapter 12, The Prince of Flesh. I was no longer Severith, not as I once was. My mortal shell had been peeled away, leaving only the perfect, terrible creation that Slaanesh had made of me. My body, now a temple to the Dark Prince, stood as a grotesque monument to both pain and pleasure, a living nightmare sculpted from flesh, bone, and demonic power. I stood above the city of Mal Salon, surveying the ruins that had once been a cesspit of human weakness. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the streets flooded with blood. The knights of Bretonnia, the plague-ridden commoners, the remnants of the city's fallen nobility, all had been consumed in the fires of my ascension. The once weak souls now writhed within the walls of the flesh garden, their screams of agony blending into the soft, melodic whispers of the warp. Mousillon was no longer a city of the living. It was my dominion, a playground of suffering. And I was its prince. My body had grown, towering over the landscape, warped by the blessings of Slaanesh. Where once I had been a man, now I was something far greater, far more horrifying. My skin shimmered with an unholy light, torn in places where the flesh had been stretched impossibly thin, revealing glistening sinew and muscle beneath. My bones jutted out from my frame like jagged spikes, sharp enough to cut through steel, and my arms had elongated into taloned limbs that could rip a man in half with a single swipe. I was both beautiful and monstrous, a reflection of Slaanesh's dual nature, pleasure and pain, ecstasy and horror. Every inch of my body radiated power, and with each breath I could feel the warp pulsating through me, a never-ending cycle of sensation that threatened to tear my mind apart, yet held me together with glorious purpose. Below me, my followers, Those wretched souls who had once served me as their master now groveled at my feet. Their bodies had been twisted and broken by the same power that had remade me, their forms barely recognizable as human. Limbs had been fused together, their skin stretched tight over bones that had been reshaped into grotesque, nightmarish configurations. Their mouths hung open, drooling and bleeding, their eyes wide with adoration and terror. They worshipped me. They feared me. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. I raised one massive clawed hand and gestured toward the broken remnants of Mal Salon. "This is what we have wrought," I whispered, my voice a low growl that echoed across the twisted landscape. "This is what you have become, a reflection of my will." The followers trembled, their twisted faces contorting into expressions of ecstasy and fear. I could feel their adoration, their blind devotion, but it filled me with nothing but disdain. They were small, insignificant. They had given everything to me, yet they were worthless now, mere playthings for my amusement. With a flick of my wrist, I sent a surge of demonic energy through the air, and the closest of my followers screamed as their bodies were torn apart. Their flesh split open, organs spilling onto the ground in wet heaps. But even in death, their faces were frozen in expressions of bliss. Their souls, still bound to my will, were sucked into the flesh garden, their agony feeding the ever-growing monument to Slaanesh's power.
I smiled. This was my purpose.
But the hunger, the endless, gnawing hunger, still remained. Even as I slaughtered, even as I remade Mousillon in my image, I could feel the void inside me growing. The power I had gained, the perfection I had sought, it was nothing more than a fleeting moment of satisfaction in a sea of endless desire. The more I carved, the more I killed, the more I killed, the more I shaped the world in Slaanesh's image, the more the hunger consumed me. But I was no longer a slave to it. I was its master. I leaped from the heights of the garden, my massive form crashing to the ground with a sickening thud, the earth beneath me cracking and splintering from the impact. Blood splattered across my feet as I walked through the streets of Mousillon, my claws dragging across the ground, leaving deep gouges in the stone. The city was a wasteland of death and ruin, its inhabitants nothing more than twisted corpses littering the streets. But in the distance I could see movement, the last remnants of resistance. A small group of knights, their armor dented and caked in blood, were making a desperate stand. They had fought their way through the horrors of the city, their determination unbroken despite the carnage around them. I admired their tenacity, but they would die all the same. As I approached, they turned to face me, their eyes widening in horror at the sight of my mutated form. Their leader, a knight bearing the sigil of the Lady of the Lake, raised his sword, his hand trembling as he pointed it toward me. "Foul daemon," he spat, his voice cracking with fear. "You will not have us. The lady will strike you down." I laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the ruined streets. The lady? She had abandoned them long ago, leaving them to die in this cursed place. They clung to their faith like drowning men clinging to driftwood, but I was the storm that would pull them under. With a single, swift motion, I lunged forward, my claws slicing through the air. The knight didn't even have time to scream before I tore through his armor, splitting his body in half. Blood sprayed across the ground as his torso fell to one side, his legs to the other. His companions staggered back, their faces pale with terror, but they did not run. They stood their ground. Fools. I ripped into them with savage glee, my claws tearing through their flesh like parchment. One by one they fell, their bodies reduced to nothing more than piles of gore at my feet. Their blood soaked the ground, mixing with the filth and mud of the ruined city. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I stepped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding with the thrill of the slaughter. I had killed them all. The knights, the nobles, the peasants, Every last soul in Mousillon had fallen to my blade. I had carved my way through them, reshaped them in Slaanesh's image, and yet the hunger still gnawed at me. The power I had gained, the perfection I had sought, it was a lie. There was no end to the hunger, no end to the desire for more. I was a daemon prince now, but even in this exalted form, I was nothing more than a vessel for Slaanesh's will. I was a slave to the very power I had sought, consumed by the same insatiable hunger that had driven me to this point. But that was the beauty of it. Slaanesh had shown me the truth. There was no end, no final goal. Only the endless pursuit, the endless craving, the endless desire for more. And I would revel in it. I turned my gaze toward the horizon, where the distant lands of Bretonnia lay beyond the cursed borders of Mal Salon. There were more souls to carve, more bodies to shape, more worlds to conquer. I would carve my name into the bones of the world, and I would never stop. For I was Severith, the Prince of Flesh, and the hunger would never be satisfied.